the 5th African Philanthropy Conference, the next frontiers of African philanthropy.
It's my great pleasure to introduce my friend, a colleague, a brother, Dr. Godwin Murunga. Godwin Murunga is now the Executive Secretary of Codesria. Should I say the outgoing executive? Because I saw the advert is out. I probably applied. I probably applied for his job, you never know. But the advert is out. Those of you that are interested in leading Codesria is going to speak more about it, hopefully, but it's one of the premier research councils in this continent on social sciences. Prior to that, Godwin was with the Africa Leadership Center in Nairobi, but also with the University of Nairobi. And I think those of you that have followed social sciences, politics, among others, you would have come across his work, academic and otherwise. But on a lighter note, for me, ever since Godwin went to Dakar, every time he has to try to fly somewhere, there's always a problem. There's always a problem. Sometime last 2 years or so ago, we were meant to meet in Mombasa for a board meeting. We sit on another board together. His flight was rerouted to Accra. He had to land in Accra before he could land in Nairobi, then Mombasa. And then this time around when he was coming here, he got to Johannesburg, and just when we were taking off, he was at the gate. KQ was delayed. And that's the reason why we had to move the keynote to today. But I'm sure he has more stories to share about his travels across the continent, given the work that he has been doing. So Godwin is going to take at least about 30 minutes or so to give us the keynote. And then thereafter, we'll take a few questions so that we can engage with him before we break into parallel sessions. Thank you. Godwin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Comrade Becky, and good morning to everyone. When you come to Victoria Falls, people don't want to greet you. That's okay. Good morning to everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you very much. Those of you who come from Ghana would know that if a flight is rerouted to Accra, you are home. So I don't know what Becky is complaining about. This is as good as it should be. I want to thank you very much, the organizers of the conference, CAPSI, Trust Africa, and all the partner institutions that managed to get all of us here. It's always a rare opportunity for me to engage colleagues in the manner in which I think we are going to. And just to make the point, to confirm to everyone who is here that yes, I am the outgoing Executive Secretary of Codesria, and I don't plan to change the Constitution. So if you can be my able successor, I welcome you to put in an application for this. The talk that I would like to spend some 30 minutes engaging you is titled Inserting Human Dignity at the Center of Giving. Inserting Human Dignity at the Center of Giving. And I'm wondering if African philanthropy is in need of an Occupy moment. And I say that because the theme of the conference is asking about the next frontier in African philanthropy. As we all know, philanthropy is above everything else about giving and care. And the feeling of care, the solidarities that make this an essential part of our life, and the endurance of practices of sharing, giving, and care, all speak to the importance of philanthropy in our societies. But we also know that those of us in Africa, we are engaged in a constant process of reconciliation of these practices of care and giving that are extant in our society, and those practices of care and giving that are new and, if you want, a little bit modern, and that frame philanthropy in a very modernist prism that embeds elements of hierarchy, even hegemony, and that give the idea of care, giving, and sharing a slightly different feel from the feel that we normally would have. As a virtue, of course, giving derives positive meaning when it's assessed against the context in which it occurs, when it's based on reasons, an understanding of the reasons why people give, when the needs it responds to are clearly understood, and when the manner of giving, the manner in which giving occurs, is properly situated. So context, reason, needs, and the manner of giving constitute, to me, an important and critical determinant of how philanthropy is perceived. It's true that giving, or acts of giving, embed power. The form of power we deploy, however, differentiates what giving means to different people whose needs we respond to, and who in turn therefore receive the support that they eventually receive on the basis of the context within which they live. So there must be a distinction drawn, in my view, between acts of giving that are exhibitionist in character and those that are really just ordinary expressions of giving. And I draw that distinction because I feel that the former carries traits of attention-seeking and conspicuousness, while the latter would embed elements of inconspicuousness that I feel is important to the idea of philanthropy. So that at the heart of the idea of philanthropy, at the heart of the idea of giving, is a question of how the power of the giver plays out. I think it's important that as we think about the next frontier of philanthropy, African philanthropy, we begin to ask questions around power and how the power of the giver plays out in contexts of philanthropy. In my view, raw power, that is exhibitionist in character, often ends up simply projecting the power of the giver. It only succeeds in centering the giver in any act of philanthropy. It projects hierarchy, if you will. And this explains how we have ended up with the unfortunate vocabulary in African philanthropy between, on the one hand, donors, and on the other hand, recipients of donor generosity. The generosity of donors becomes the central cog, in my view, around which discussions of philanthropy takes place, and the capacity of quote-unquote recipients to think the idea of their priorities and agenda are considered in most cases as only of secondary value in this situation. As such, the agency of people as thinking beings is determined best on their situation of being in need as recipients of what is given to them. Their dignity as human beings ends up being taken away. And I feel that we are at a point where, in talking about the next frontier of African philanthropy, it's important for us to begin to talk about the question of human dignity, to talk about that question in relation to the agency of people whose needs philanthropy is designed to respond to. I feel that this conference, being the 5th in the series that Trust Africa and CAPSI have held, gives us an important opportunity to begin to reflect on the changes that have taken place in society, how they have raised the question of philanthropy as an exhibitionist thing, and how African philanthropy ought to be not just a reaction to, but actually an antidote to this form of philanthropy, this form of giving that hasn't centered human dignity at the heart of it. And it's important that in Africa we have that question, because in the overall framework of development thinking, Africa is often seen as the recipient. Africa is always seen as the developing context within which development is received from outside. So I want to spend a bit of time to make the point that the space that has been occupied by development aid over the years that we have existed is a space that has changed so significantly that it's inviting those of us who are involved in thinking about and practicing African philanthropy to begin to frame our discourse in a slightly different way. And the point I want to make, which is my second point, is really to ask the question, is African philanthropy ready to occupy the space that I detect is being left by the development industry? Last year, Becky, you will remember, we organized a meeting on resource mobilization in Dakar, and we invited Professor Fantu Sheru to give an intervention. And the outstanding statement he made on that day was that development aid, as we have known it, is on its deathbed. Development aid, as we have known it, is on its deathbed. So let me spend a few minutes just talking about development aid and the spaces that I feel are being left as this process that Fantu Sheru so ably explained means for us. For too long, development in Africa has been framed as a state project. Yet the organization of power within state forms in Africa has sort of rendered the state as more of an instrument of control and extraction, rather than as an agent of emancipation and transformation of societies in Africa. It is a state project that, in more instances than not, proceeds in spite of the people. The late Professor Claude Ake spent quite a bit of time discussing this particular situation in his book, Revolutionary Pressures in Africa. And in his study on democracy and development, he centers human agency, the agency of people and human dignity and self-reliance are central to the process of development. So the focus on the role of the state, and especially in how state-society relations are negotiated, remains for me a very important element of discussing development as we go forward. The state generally in Africa still retains very colonial characteristics. This is more than half a century after. The state still thinks of development as something that is imported from outside rather than something that is done locally. So an unnecessarily significant amount of initiatives of development on the continent are framed or carried on the back of both bilateral and multilateral initiatives in which words like Millennium Development Goals, words like Sustainable Development Goals, take a disproportionate amount of our attention in talking about development. Discussions around development are seen to require to comply with these international goals, as if we all exist in a homogeneous society in which our needs, our expectations, our desires for development are the same. And most African countries to date still think about the desire of development in terms of meeting those goals. We still hear of the need to attract, for instance, foreign investors. We still hear of the need to insert the logic of entrepreneurship into our development initiatives. We still hear of the need to export African labor force outside. Jobs are out there, they are not in here. And we still hear of a desire to grow and expand the private sector as important elements of development. It doesn't matter that more often than not, the private sector we talk about is not necessarily always homegrown. The private sector that we want to attract is almost always foreign. And those elements of the local private sector that we want to attract are always thought of as an appendage of the foreign actors that we are being invited. So for me, the overall question that we haven't really had a time to discuss and really put at the table is that over and above, we need a developmental infrastructure that is conducive to the generality of the peoples of Africa before you can think about who else you need to attract into the realm of development. And this is the situation that has attracted a whole range of bilateral and multilateral institutions that play a significant role in framing the argument around development in Africa. The place of the collection of bilateral institutions that operate, especially under the tag of overseas development aid, or if you will, assistance, I think looms a little bit too large in the discussion we have, especially if we want to think about the role of African philanthropy in this particular context. The development discourse, therefore, begins to lean a little bit too heavy on attracting foreign aid. And this is presented as a good thing. Even more tellingly for me is that the basis upon which foreign aid is organized is really around a range of agencies of state in the global north that have identified a need of providing assistance to overseas targets. So tellingly, both in terms of its original colonial orientation and even today, overseas development assistance is seen to target economic development, but watch the word, to improve the welfare of people of developing economies. Do I need to remind you that over 60 years of overseas development has not substantially changed the very logic of development in Africa, and has not substantially changed the very situation of African peoples as we know it. Overseas assistance has a founding logic in colonial developmentalism, that post-war era in which a desire to begin to intervene in response to nationalist agitation, intervene to improve the welfare of the colonized people, was thought about. Overseas development carries a hegemonic role, but it's not hegemonic in the sense that it is useful in terms of how it mediates questions of power. It actually carries, if you want to be blunt, a heavy dose of extremely disastrous policies that have altered our trajectory of development. In the few years that we have experienced our discussion around overseas assistance, there are a few cases that you can point to that speak to what it means to frame assistance, what it means to frame giving in a manner that helps develop the agency of those whose lives you are intervening in, and also, of course, in terms of growing development. One can point out the experience of the Nordic countries, for instance, their support to countries like Tanzania, where the agency and the agenda for development was carefully thought about in terms of how it improves the lives of people. Under, for instance, in Sweden, the leadership of Olof Palme, we know that a very significant transformation was done in order to make sure that overseas assistance does not just piggyback on priorities that are external to the continent, but rather that priorities that are internal to the experiences of these people. Our colleague, Sabelo Lovo Gasheni, has just published a book through Codesria, which we'll be releasing next week, that demonstrates the connection between overseas assistance and the influence, say, of Sweden in Tanzania. But we all want to put on the table the fact that the nature of overseas assistance has transformed so significantly in the last several years that it becomes actually very difficult to remember that some of these interesting ways in which overseas assistance was done ever existed. Because the general climate across the continent is one in which one can say there is an anti-development aid movement that is growing across the third world, and it's raising some very significant questions about how development aid has essentially become the excuse around which many African leaders are evading to answer the question of what their responsibilities to the people of their continent or of their countries is. Clearly, the data is also demonstrating that there's a major shift, in fact, in terms of how much overseas development aid means to our continent. In the 1970s, for instance, the nominal ODA volume witnessed a phenomenal increase, rising by about over 14% per annum on average. This slowed down just over 8.4% average rate. Sorry, this slowed to just over 8.4% average rate of annual growth in the 1980s, while in the 1990s, it contracted at an average of over 1% per year. And we're just talking about 1970s to 1990s. Today, the general mood across Europe and North America is very clear to us. When you listen to the MAGA movement, it's all about prioritizing America. Many European countries have actually moved to the extreme right. And the central question that this is raising about development aid is very simple. Why are you wasting our resources on them when we have priorities here that we need to talk about? Just last year, Sweden as a country did reduce the amount of funds allocated to overseas development. And there's a general trend across Europe that is basically asking the question, why are you giving aid when in fact any form of transaction ought to be framed in the context of trade? And of course the reference is the World Trade Organization as a framework. Now anybody who knows about how those institutions work, they are not there to help Africans. They don't owe Africans anything. So that at the end of the day, when we begin to talk about the context of foreign aid and we think about the role of African philanthropy, I think that the general trend where Europe is withdrawing from this particular relationship is one that we need to be paying attention to in Africa, because it's going to raise very significant questions. Let me also put the point across that we may talk about development aid as an important player in this whole development process. But actually, our colleagues at NORAD are currently running a project in which they are asking us to rethink development in Africa and to question the role of foreign aid as a player in Africa's development. And they have made a very important point which I need to put at the table, that all funds, all resources available for overseas development in the world, all funds, all resources available for overseas development in the world are less than the GDP of Kenya and Tanzania combined. All resources available for overseas development are less than the GDP of Kenya and Tanzania combined. In other words, the two economies of Kenya and Tanzania, two economies out of how many countries in Africa? So essentially the point we are making here is that we are fighting over resources that are very limited and that we need to think differently about, because they are not going to make that significant change for Africa. Those of us who work in the governance sector, I know that Trust Africa and CAPSI work around some of these questions. The amount of funds available to fund governance in Africa from abroad, less than 5%, have been reducing. And those are what we are fighting for. The question becomes, how are we doing governance in Africa on the assumption that we're receiving, which raises important questions about the recent experience in Kenya, where the government, facing large-scale protests from the youth, target one foundation and say, you are the problem. And I'm not sure that the Ford Foundation does provide anything over 1% of support. And the point I'm saying is that there is an initiative, a movement on the continent that is saying something else that African philanthropy should align with. Because this retreat of development aid as a key player in our work is very important. Let me go to my final point, which is about what are the major changes that we are therefore seeing on the continent, and what are they asking of us, practitioners and scholars of African philanthropy. So clearly, the message that one hears from the continent and which our colleague Bayo Lukoshi raised in very interesting words is this: that we have to stop, the world has to stop this basic instinct of assuming that it has a monopoly of solutions to Africa's problems. And African leaders have to also stop this assumption that the solutions to Africa's problems rest somewhere in Europe or in North America. This is the important change that we need to. And those of us within the frameworks of African philanthropy, I think, are better placed to begin to handle this point. Because if you are involved in the exercise of giving, and you're locating your acts of giving in a situation where you understand the situation of the people you are dealing with, then at the end of the day, you are better positioned to instigate an Occupy movement that will restore the dignity of the people for whom you work. What are the few things that I'm seeing on the continent that are important? Number one, as I said, there's a very vibrant critique of foreign aid as an important element to our work. And the statistics are showing that foreign aid is not as much as important as it has framed itself to be. Indeed, the question ought to be put on the table that if overseas development assistance was meant to resolve Africa's development challenges, 60 years down the line, should indeed have committed suicide. Because how can you be engaged in an exercise of helping others to develop over 60 years and we're not seeing a significant transformation in the manner in which we are working? So there is an anti-aid movement on the continent, and it's not just a movement that is silly and nuisance. It's a movement that is asking questions about accountability, questions about power asymmetries that exist in society. And it's increasingly seeing development aid more as an instrument or a vehicle of domination rather than a vehicle of emancipation of our societies. And this movement is making progress. And it provides an opportunity for people who are engaged in philanthropy in Africa to align their goals with some of these movements because of the fundamental ways in which they are asking us to rethink the paradigm of assistance, to rethink the paradigm of giving. There's a second movement that is becoming increasingly important. It is a movement that is really dominated by younger people. And it's asking the question, why can't we rely on internally generated resources to fund our development? Now think of the young people in Niger, in Burkina Faso, in Mali. Essentially asking questions about the monetary system that exists in that region and the fact that out of the huge resources that those countries do have, they haven't, as people in those countries, enjoyed the value of those resources. And more often than not, we get sidetracked into focusing on whether it's a military coup or something else. But actually, the challenge is not whether it's a military coup or people are asking about everyday livelihood questions. And they are saying, why do we need to be supported to develop when, in fact, we have the requisite resources to do it ourselves? And there was, of course, a conversation in Burkina Faso between Sarkozy and the young students in the university in Burkina Faso. We saw Macron do the same thing in Senegal. And we saw last year, I think when you were holding this conference last year, you had to run out of town. You ran away from us to go to Sali. Because the young people in Dakar were asking very difficult questions about the situation in Senegal itself. And the point I'm making there is not to shame Becky and Brima. It's to say that you are at the heart and you witnessed the very reality that the young people in Senegal are asking about their own lives. And the point is that reliance on internally generated resources has become a very, very important element of how we think about funding development and how we think that the ends of development must benefit we, quote unquote, the people. And it's now becoming clearer that there are some subnational entities within Africa that can actually generate a lot of resources for development. In Nigeria, there is a conversation about how much resources Lagos as a state generates, and whether those resources can actually facilitate a better livelihood for people, right? And we can go across the continent and identify some of those experiences. In the years of Mwai Kibaki in Kenya, over 90% of the development budget was being funded from locally generated resources. And many of our countries, we are alive to the fact there was a time when the IMF was a useless entity in terms of how we were thinking about our own organization of development within. And I think that African philanthropy needs to piggyback on some of these things in order to ask questions. Trust Africa a while ago did run a major project on illicit financial flows. And that project suggested that it's not the rest of the world that is funding our development, it's Africa that is funding the rest of the world. Under the leadership of Obasanjo, there was a huge attempt to bring back the resources in Nigeria that had been taken away under the leadership of Abacha. And even the little countries in Europe that are keeping this money were setting conditions, right? Setting conditions on how they return the money. And a huge chunk of African resources are sitting somewhere out there. The negotiations that have been going on in the UN and OECD around the tax regimes is one that is beginning to receive only a limited amount of attention and a limited amount of success, as we saw at the UN last year. But the question still remains at the table that why are we struggling when in fact there's this important thing? And I have a whole range of other additional points I would like to put, but let me conclude on making the point around demographic change and what that means for Africa. Because for us in Africa, I think that the demographic changes are beginning to force young people to ask questions afresh that were asked in the 1960s, 1970s. Those of us in academia do know that in the context of discussions around state-society relations, across the continent, we put on the table the national question. What is the contract that puts us together to live in a Nigeria, for instance? We even extended that into a Pan-African conversation, because at the heart of the Pan-African conversation was something to do with development, but was also something around which we galvanized our efforts to fight off tendencies that underrated our work. And today the young people are asking the same questions. It looks like they are new questions, but in fact they are restating questions that had been asked before. I have mentioned Burkina Faso, I have mentioned Mali, I have mentioned Niger, I have mentioned Senegal. We are going through the process in Kenya at the moment, and one gets the sense that they are not getting it even in Kenya. And these questions are expanding in Nigeria and other places. And the point I'm trying to make here is these demographic changes are forcing people to begin to ask the question about self-reliance. Many of the young people are not waiting to receive handouts. They are not waiting. They're just saying, you've trained me, I'm capable, I can do something. How come you are not enabling me to do it? They are setting up interesting networks of collaboration that are fighting for very specific targets around the question of transformation. And my point is that if we're not paying attention to these generational changes and the questions they are asking, then we're going to miss the boat. So that when young people begin to say about the military or whatever, we feel like they are talking a language that we resolved in the 1960s, 1970s, but actually this has an immediacy in their life that we hardly are appreciating. So I would like to conclude by saying that you have a huge resource in African philanthropy to begin to reframe our agenda in a manner that aligns with the agenda of many of these forces on the continent that are beginning to ask questions about What does giving mean? To what ends are we doing the giving? And are you undermining my dignity as a human being if I receive what you're giving? Philanthropy can be based on a sound popular pressure to alter the nature of politics on the continent, to change the relationship between state and society, to emphasize the role of civil society not as recipients of donor funds, but as agenda-setting institutions that frame the conversation in a manner that begins to go towards a transformation of our societies. And so I have not talked too much about philanthropy, Becky, but I thought that the framework of the discussion that we need to have in order to go to the next frontier is asking of us to instigate an Occupy movement that is based on a certain set of principles that should restore our own dignity as Africans, our own dignity as human beings, and to negotiate a presence in the world that really endorses the reality of our common humanity. Thank you very much.
You know, traditionally we do not question or even, litigate the presentation by the keynote speech. But for us, it's in an academic conference. The main thing is about questioning. And so, Dr. Murunga, we are going to provide a few minutes, of questioning or just to try to understand certain parts of the elements. And also, given that we are in the next frontiers, and you've spoken about the next frontiers, especially the Occupy movements that we are having in Africa, and also alluded to what we had in Senegal last year. It was real-time experience to be escorted by military from Dakar to Sali for the main conference. So I'm going to allow about 10 minutes of questioning. So try to be crisp and clear on the question that you are going to, put across to Dr. Murunga. I'm going to allow 4 rounds of questions for the first one, and then we are going to finish with the 4. Unfortunately, we may not take everyone, but we are going to try to, accommodate as the largest extent of our diversity that we can for the moment. So I hope there is a roaming mic somewhere. I see there is Prof. Ali there. So in terms of the diversity, it's like I want to see this side and this side. So we'll start with Prof. Ali. Yeah, it's up there. Is the mic working? Yeah, the mics are working, so there's no need for roaming mic.
Okay, super. My name is Ali Aouni. I'm with the American University in Cairo. Dignity comes from the recipient. If the recipient does not have a clear agenda, what does he want to do with the money, whether it's coming from foreign sources or philanthropy, he's going to be exploited eventually. So that's very clear. I don't think we have an agenda. We never had an agenda. That's my first part. The second part, I've sensed, and you've mentioned it a little bit, I've sensed a little bit of the same rhetoric of the 1960s. Revolve. I mean, instead of kick them out, you're telling them, I don't need your aid. Fine, brilliant. But what is the alternative? And I agree there are resources in Africa, but you have to have a clear agenda, again, how are you going to go about it? And it's not clear. I mean, other than the rhetoric, which sometimes is needed, we need to get to a plan. Thank you.
May we have another question on this same side? Preferably at the end, the other side. Okay, the gentleman in a pink, I'm very colorblind, but I think it's Dr. Nyati. Sorry.
Thank you very much. I think the problem that we have, especially in Africa, is that we appear to be ideologically bankrupt in terms of what we want to achieve in terms of development. Very much disorganized, very much bankrupt in terms of philosophy. At one point, there was so much talk about African solutions to African problems. I don't know what happened to that kind of mantra. And at one point, there was so much talk about localization of development. I'm not so sure where we are in terms of all those attempts. If you look at the fundamentals that informed NEPAD, I think the idea was to try and ensure that the trajectory of development is determined by Africans. We have damned that kind of thinking. And right now, we're not so sure on where we are going. I think that's my contribution. We are ideologically bankrupt. Africa doesn't know where it will be in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years. And I think our situation is further complicated by a whole lot of historical contingencies and collapsing infrastructure, collapsing institutions, the problem of kleptocracy, you name it. We are in quandary precisely.
Yeah, thank you. Let's try to keep them as short and crisp as possible. We are this side now, so, and I'd prefer ladies because we've had two gentlemen. In the spirit of diversity, if we don't have a lady, then please go ahead. There was, but we are this side now. Go ahead.
Me? Me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, thank you for an excellent keynote speech. I am just asking a very simple question. Should Africa say no to the philanthropy and from the Western philanthropy or from outside of Africa? And if that is an answer, and then when should we say no? Is it today? Is it tomorrow? Or should we collectively, as an African, 54 countries should say at time no, and which country should say no? This question has been a lot of, it has been prevailing, and in the literatures there has been a lot of controversies. I'm just trying to get your reflections on this.
Thank you, Dr. Murunga. The last one, sorry, the lady here, just right in front of me. Yes, it's you. Yes, you, thanks.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Prof. My name is Karen Pillay. I'm from the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. I like what you said about where countries, where the Nordic countries are coming to Africa and saying, what are your problems? Let's work together. We're not giving you charity, but we are saying, let's work together so that you can elevate yourself. So I'm asking, how do we change the narrative? Instead of saying we don't want your aid, we change the narrative to say, what aid are you providing that is not dominant aid, but that works together with us? So how do we change that narrative across ODA? And I think that is the question that Africa needs to, or that is the space where we need to start the more important discussions around. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think you can use the podium where you are. Or okay, fine, sure, thanks.
No, sorry, thank you very much for the interventions, and really I take them as, for me at least, I take them as an invitation to a conversation that is incomplete. And I didn't aim in the presentation to give a complete picture. I feel that Africa is a very complex and difficult continent to deal with, and our own experiences do speak to this. But I also think that if you carry an overly pessimistic picture of the continent, a continent that you cannot run away, the Europeans don't want you across. I mean, we've all gone through the stories around immigration and migrants. They don't want you there. So our challenge is really to fix our continent. And the reality of collapsing infrastructure, the reality of all these things is a reality that we live. But you also get the sense that people haven't given up. People aren't waiting to receive goodies for not wanting to do their work. And I do appreciate, therefore, the point around dignity coming from the recipients. I do appreciate that point. But can we say that Africa has not, in fact, articulated an agenda that can define the nature of the relationships between the continent and the rest of the world? I think that would be unfair. What was the Lagos Plan of Action all about? Now, we can dismiss it as being a baggage of the 1970s, 1980s, but here was an experiment in thinking through very carefully about how to organize the future of the continent based on a sound understanding of the situation at the time, right? And different countries have elaborated different ways of managing their own affairs in a way that can advance transformation in their societies. This is the question that I hear people raising in the Sahel, for instance. How can we think about our development as our own project rather than development as received wisdom from elsewhere? Not from any other African country, not from any, but as received as something that we think through. And I feel that I think it is a little unfair to say that we have not figured out an agenda. And the NEPAD project was indeed an attempt to think through that process. The work of the four leaders who led that project. The fact of attempting to do our own internal ways of accountability. As a Kenyan, I would say that one of the lost moments in that particular project was the NEPAD assessments demonstrating very, very clearly that if Kenya didn't transform significantly from the path it was on, the danger lay ahead of a major form of violence that would disrupt the whole society. And it did not take more than 10 years for us to experience that, for having refused to listen to this kind of analysis that was already coming from institutions that are on the continent. So I feel that, yes, we have problems, we have challenges that we need to deal with, and they look overwhelming, but I wouldn't carry an overly pessimistic picture about the path forward. I wouldn't carry an overwhelming rejection of the capacity of Africans to think about where they want to go. My own thinking would be that there is a tension in society and a struggle over visions of development, and one has not fully won over the others. Should Africa say no to philanthropy? I think there is a very nuanced response that we can develop around this question. I was not able to show the nuances in the experience with the aid industry. But there are instances where philanthropy, there's instances where aid has transformed some societies. And there are instances where that transformation has carried for years, for decades, and then collapsed. When you listen to people who worked with the late Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, the point when it was clear to him that he has to resign and move on to other things was the point when the development ideals that he had stood for and fought for began to experience challenges, attacks from some of the constituencies, both within Tanzania and outside Tanzania. Challenges that indicated to him that he was not going to win. Okay? And so a major change happens in Tanzania at that particular moment. And maybe one wishes that our African leaders would also do the same, to really figure out that when it's not working, and we need a course correction. Okay? So I don't think that there is one unified, homogeneous answer around whether we need aid, we need philanthropy and all that. I think there is a nuanced response that can be given. Where it doesn't facilitate transformation of society, where it doesn't help, it becomes a basic ideology for sustaining a relationship that is already broken and that is inimical to the existence of the very people that it's supposed to help. And I think we are able to make that distinction in many instances. And I think that many people across the continent are raising that question. And I feel that the youth movements that are beginning to ask these significant questions, in the whole of West Africa, this was a major issue across the board. Some of the transformations that have happened in countries like Senegal are based on a sustained attack on a notion of development that is basically external in orientation. And you see, if you look at the work of Sila Ndongo, for instance, you begin to see some of the ways in which this has been expressed. So I hesitate to say that Africans don't have an agenda, they don't know what to do. At least my own reading of the Senegalese experience suggests to me that they were very clear what they wanted to do, and they have achieved a modicum of success in achieving some of the things that they seek to do. And I feel that I'm very hesitant to do a very pessimistic reading of this situation. So that's